the Second Renaissance podcast. Artists, activists, contemplatives, and visionaries forging pathways through the meta-crisis to a second renaissance and a wiser, weller world.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Life Itself's Second Renaissance podcast series. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Layman Pascal, who used to be a meditation teacher, yoga instructor, and philosopher of integral meta theory, and is now feeling much better. Today he leads the metamodern spirituality labs, hosts the Integral Stage and Soul Makers Plus podcast, helps edit Emerge, as well as many other things. And Layman is known for his philosophical work on the metaphysics of adjacency, analytic non-duality, coaxial developmental stage theories, and the neurological correlates of meditation, among others. And in general, I think it's really interested, and you could tell us more in a moment, Layman, is about how do we embody spirituality? How do we actually live the future paradigm that we want to come in the postmodern civilization, which is facing numerous accelerating and converging crises? So I wanted to begin, first of all, big welcome here, Layman. It's great to be with you.
You too. Good to see you.
I wanted to start by asking you to tell me a little bit about how did you come to this area or interest in these kind of topics, second renaissance, liminal web, integral, metamodern, etc. And even was there anything unusual about your childhood? Maybe even start there. How did you grow up? Was it a very conventional life, or was it quite unconventional?
Well, more and more now, I think in terms of the shamanoid as a category of a particular type of neurogenetic diversity that inclines some people toward predilections that might have got them selected for esoteric training in archaic civilizations. I think I have a bunch of the markers for that. And I think some people in my family have. So let's say I inherited some of the witch blood. So very early on, I was obsessed with thresholds, liminal states, non-human entities, altered states of consciousness, getting my hands on any kind of psychological, mythological, or spiritual training material I could find, trying to bring the subconscious and my interests in cosmology and psychology and linguistics and ecology all together in some way. So I had that as just a disposition. But I grew up on an island in the Pacific Northwest that was home to several waves of utopians, including some 1970s Back to the Land people that spawned myself. And it was a really safe, lush, organically well-nourished place. And my parents were intelligent, loving, world-traveled people who let us do any kind of conversations we wanted. So they weren't always into the things that I was obsessed by naturally, but they were willing to entertain any conversation that I wanted to bring up. So it allowed me to flesh out a lot of my ideas. So I might have gotten a fortunate circumstance in which to unfold a kind of instinctive curriculum that I felt was in myself. So that by the time I was in high school, I was deeply informed by world religions, deeply informed by psychological modalities, deeply informed by surrealism and other altered state practices, really interested in a kind of transdisciplinary attempt to bring all of the different fields of my interest together. And naturally, spirituality and religion was a big part of that. And that became my pursuit for my 20s.
Just say a little bit more about your childhood. So it's an island in the Pacific Northwest. And I mean, was it communal? Were you living individually? Were you actually tending the land? You were going to school. And what were you studying? What did it actually look like?
So there's a little town called Sointula, although I live with Finns now, so they say Sointula. But it's on Malcolm Island. It's a decent sized island with a very small population. There's a couple of paved roads, but we lived several miles out on a gravel road. A very big piece of land, a lot of ocean front, sloped. So a lot of fields, horses, cows, chickens, pigs, big like acre and a half garden that was terraced on the slope. And then all the rest of the property is basically forests with some ravines and creeks in them. So, although my dad did a lot of things, forestry, he worked on a fish boat at the Aquacudal Reserve, which was on the next island. And my mother looked after the house and the garden. But basically, we produced most of our own foods. We're fairly independent, but we're in a kind of like loose allied network with other reasonably well-educated hippie back to the land families. And there's sort of a loose exchange program between there. And then you would take the school bus into town to go to the school, and it was grades 1 to 7, which totaled about like 90 kids. And it was just a real Canadian West Coast, left-leaning, nature-immersed kind of situation. Quite delightful, really nice for kids to be in that situation. Lots of people to play with, lots of intelligence, lots of nature.
And is it still existing, that community, or what's happened to that island? Just out of interest, this is an aside almost, I'm going off topic, but
I mean, I've been back a few times. It's still there. It's still got a lot of that same vibe, even though many of the families, as their kids got older, did like my family and moved to larger cities to provide opportunities and education for the kids. It's a little bit different now. It's more, a lot of the fish boats are now tourist boats. There's a few more cafes and more internet and those sorts of things than there used to be. Uh, there's not much going on there. The vibe is beautiful. The land is beautiful. I would even consider moving back there if there was, a community or things to do there. But really, it's a very bucolic, out of the way, low population. It's not as cosmopolitan as I need for the work that I do.
right. I mean, I want to know this, we can come back to it, but this question of, practical utopias, or how do we actually create pockets of new paradigm living, like you're just describing, as this incredible environment, but then obviously there's maybe some degree of lacking of kind of the cosmopolitan, or the of others who are, they're similar in some ways, but enough of the energy. But anyway, so okay, you're there, you grow up, you then go into high school. And can you say a bit more about like what you were reading or coming across? You said you're very open-minded parents, but you said you got interested in spirituality and also psychology. Like what kind of things were really actual comic books you were reading? There's the abstract description of them, but
Yeah.
for listeners, what does it actually look like for you? What did you come across? Were there any books that
So
particularly influenced you, or thinkers or people?
one of the interesting things was my grandmother, my mother's mother. She died when I was quite young, but she specifically told me that she'd left me some books. So they were on the shelf, but you're working your way up as your cognitive and linguistic capacity increases. But I got to those books pretty early, and a lot of them were late 19th century, early 20th century books on Eastern meditative practices and Western occult and esoteric practices. So, in particular, I was a big fan of Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages. Giant, beautiful book. The pages were all in Roman numerals. So, you'd look something up in the index and you had to see how quick you could convert it into Latin numbering. But it had sections on the notebooks of the medieval alchemists. It had sections on the possible relationship between Norse mythology and Buddhism. It had sections on Renaissance magic. It had sections on the possible initiatory significance of structures in the Greek pyramids. Like, it was a really rich, comprehensive compendium, a beautiful book, very stimulating. And for the kind of superstitious magical mindset that kids have, it brought a lot of rigor to that. So it wasn't just like, oh, magic. It was like, oh, maybe magic, if it exists, has to be tested and has a structure and has a lore and has a lineage. So it built a lot of infrastructure to my childish sensibilities around occult wonder. Later, I got into a lot of science reading and a lot of sort of logic reading. There was a beautiful book called Aha by the parapsychology debunker and rationalist Martin Gardner, but it was full of elaborate logical paradoxes. And I as like an intimation of my later life obsession with non-dual states, I became really deeply interested in the structure of paradox, what it does to the mind, but also the emotional state that paradox seems to be allowing you to have access to. When I moved into high school, so we moved from the island down to Victoria at the south end of Vancouver Island. Then I had access to all kinds of wonderful fiction. I started to devour any big picture science fiction universe, but also any stories that had, higher dimensional spaces or the void or any of these kinds of things in them. That was fascinating. I read all the material by people who were involved in early 20th century avant-garde art movements. I was a big consumer of manifestos, particularly Dada and Surrealism and metaphysical art, things like that. Read a lot of Carl Jung, um, read a lot of the Wilsons, British author Colin Wilson, who's created this thing called the New Existentialism and the attempt to mutate people through induced peak experiences. And in the United States, Robert Anton Wilson, who was kind of my boyhood hero. Got to meet him, got to meet his friend Timothy Leary when I was young, right before both of them died. So they were big mind expanders for me and examples of what the ancient transdisciplinary and alchemical quest looks like when transported into late 20th century. So in my mind, a lot of those guys were what it just seemed natural for me to try to build on their work, right? That was normal. That was the guys who were succeeding, as far as I could tell, who were like me in the previous generation. Then I just had to like move that thing forward.
And what can you, because I'm not familiar. So you said Robert Anton
Wilson.
Wilson. Tell me a bit. I'm not familiar with this person. So tell me a bit more about. I mean, you said this is a kind of almost this was an archetype that you were looking to in your own life as kind of something that really
Yeah.
inspired you. Tell me a bit about.
Interesting guy. So uh, he was interested in being able to access multiple what he called reality tunnels, right? So he was part of a 50s and 60s movement where they were using ritual and psychedelics to try to reprogram their brains, largely in tandem, both with famous weirdos in the European tradition, like Gurdjieff, like Aleister Crowley, people like that, but also in tandem with the theories that were coming out of Harvard at that time around Timothy Leary and Ram Dass and John Lilly and being the meta programmer of your own consciousness. So he was really involved in that. And he was also the one of the editors at Playboy magazine. And his job was to respond to letters that people sent into the magazine, him and this other guy, Robert Shea. And every so often they get a letter that was just completely bizarre, right? Conspiratorial, occult weirdness, the president's a lizard, all these sorts of things. So they kept these letters. They didn't publish them in the magazine. And after a while, they started to try to imagine what the world would be like if all of these letters were true. Like if these were all accurate reports of reality somehow, what coherent picture would emerge? And together they wrote a huge book called the Illuminatus Trilogy. And it's the book where they attempt to describe the universe as if all these people were correct. And he went on from there to write several other books, the Schrodinger's Cat Trilogy, Prometheus Rising, Cosmic Trigger, a beautiful, weird little book called Reality is What You Can Get Away With. And he was really, he looked like, as he got older, a kind of Taoist sage, bald and like a long white beard, really well versed in quantum mechanics, really well versed in the leading edge thinkers of the United States, right? A big Buckminster Fuller fan, close friends of Albert Korzybski and General Semantics, right? Part of the unfolding hybridization of spirituality and brain science and computational science and new physics that was going on in the mid 20th century. And very funny, very interesting guy. Did a lot of sophisticated practices in ways that were peculiar, colloquial, novel. Like to make jokes about reality. Considered humor to be a necessary quality to keep yourself from going crazy when you stray outside the limits of the conventional reality tunnel.
And So then, okay, so you finish high school. What happened then? You went to university, or you went to, or you didn't, or what happened then?
Yeah, I got a scholarship to go to the University of Victoria. Um, and so I did that, but I didn't complete anything there because I just hated it. But I ended up emotionally, it didn't work for me. The whole
Mm.
vibe just was wrong. But they had a great library. So I stayed as long as it took me to read everything I wanted to read in the library. And then my girlfriend and I moved to Belize, lived
Wow.
there for a while. And I was obsessed with finding, the ancient secrets. We're going to find some crystal skulls and talk to jaguar spirits and check out those Mayan temples, right? The idea that there was ancient, maybe paraconscious secrets imaginally buried in landscapes and in ancient peoples was driving me. And yet I didn't find those things. It seemed kind of like a spiritually denuded place. The most of the things I saw there were not very interesting. So we ended up coming back up to North America, and it was like I re-fell in love with contemporary culture as the site of what was going on. I became very interested in analyzing what was going on as sort of the postmodern condition of the world that I felt I was in and was a part of. I became very dedicated to a number of different spiritual practices and spiritual communities that I lived in and around. I started to write.
For example,
Yep.
what kind of communities did you live in, or practices? What practices did you do? Or yeah.
So um, a number of mm, Eastern teachers and Eastern inspired teachers. Particularly, there was a kind of a Vedantic mystic who lived on Salt Spring Island, which was not far away, named Baba Hari Das. He was silent, but you could go and get his chalkboard discourses and build rock walls with him in his little community. And that was one of the most important things for me because everything he wrote down as answers to people's questions sounded simplistic to the point of being garbage to me. Like I didn't care for anything he had to communicate, but his presence was something that astonished me. Right? It was palpable. It was almost visible. And so I started to get this sense that there was a real big distinction between what people said they'd done and what they said they knew and what they'd been able to become. So the difference between these, let's say,
Mm.
the development of one's being and what one happens to think about that became very different. And that kind of guided my interactions with other teachers. I lived with this community. They called themselves Parayana Buddhists. It was a kind of Buddhism that came out of the Shaolin Temple down through Indonesia back, but I could never tell. Maybe it was all bullshit. They might have been making up their own lineage, but it was a more serious form of the development of mind strength and compassion in a very classical way and built around with sort of Buddhist psychology and things like that. I was very involved with Gurdjieffians. I was very involved with some of the Adida movements. I was very involved with some of the Osho Rajneesh communities. So all of that, and I also began to just become a promiscuous explorer of every kind of temple and teacher I could find, and an internal generator of esoteric practices. So after a while, instead of testing out meditation techniques, I started to be constantly inventing new ones. And that became my general occupying tendency at that time. Mm, yeah. What else?
Well, so what so you've got this incredible curiosity and interest. What can in the inner world, and in I would say the not only the classically contemplative domain, but like as you said, you're kind of promiscuous, the whole shebang, from the shamanic, the magical, the whole gamut of this area of the mystical, the mysterious. What personal experiences you had that, I mean, because you'd read a lot, you'd been very inspired, but you must have had also internal experience that touched you or not, or was it?
Yeah. And that was a very tricky thing. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's what was driving me. right? So I had had a number of experiences when I was a kid that were either visionary or affectively transcendental in certain ways. So I was aware that my system could do that. And then when I got a little bit older and I was inspired by these 60s guys, I had tried some intense psychedelic experiences in my early 20s. And so that also confirmed that those experiences were part of what was available to me. And then it became much more of a deliberate attempt to see if practices could generate these experiences. And that became an intellectual problem for me, which was there didn't seem to be a strong correlation between any particular practice and any particular outcome. Like I devised this thing. So one day, I was staying at my friend's house, and I was doing this thing where wherever my consciousness went, kind of a Vipassana practice, right? Whatever's coming up, then you apply some kind of an insight to it. So it was to reframe any experiential uncertainty in the form of a question, to turn it into an articulated conscious question. And it was a fun little practice. But after I'd done it for about an hour, and I was always doing these experimental practices, it was like my whole mind flushed out. And I got up and I went outside. And as far as I could tell, I was the deity. And I just wandered around in this bizarre, blissful state. And it was perfect. It was the solution to everything I'd been looking for. And I ended up wandering down to this gazebo on the water. I thought, well, maybe I should make some notes in case this is useful to anyone else. And this girl rode by on this bicycle, and I'm like, oh my God, she's riding way too slow. And as I watched her, I returned to my sense of being myself. And I thought, oh, this is what the teachers are always telling you. The goddess got me again, returned me to the world. uh, and so the next day, of course, I tried to do the same practice to get the same result. Didn't work. And I ended up formulating this thing I called the 1 millionth customer. And so you go down to the store, you walk into the store, it turns out you're the 1 millionth customer. And bells go off and confetti falls and they give you like a free ham or whatever they do. Fantastic. The next time you go in, it's not going to happen because it wasn't the result of you going into the store that day. It was the result of all these other things, hundreds of thousands of them that have previously happened. So even though there's not a direct correlation between the states and the practices, there is a correlation between the whole accumulating body of your practices, which pay off periodically in these shift experiences. So that started to be the way that I saw it. And then there was also a shift in I used to say ARCO, an accumulated residual cognition of oneness, because I told myself that I was mostly looking for experiential cognition of oneness, and I was periodically breaking through into this. But the more times I did that,
just say, so this basically non-dual states where you felt one with the world, where there was no sense, what you just described on the waterfront, just so people get it listening, and you'd already got to a point you were giving an acronym and you wanted to cultivate more of those.
Yes. But as I succeeded in having these kinds of experiences, they decreased in importance. And so I changed the acronym to the accumulated residual cognition of oneness, because what became more and more interesting was not these breakthroughs, but some background sensibility that seemed to build up as a result of these breakthroughs. So then I started to feel like, oh, I'm faithful in some way, right? I have this trust in being that's emerging. That's very interesting. And in some ways, that led me back into a lot of the philosophy that I'd been studying when I was younger. And then there were also certain particular breakthroughs, like one in particular had occurred one morning at a bus stop where I just became really intensely focused on the degree to which I was thwarting my own ability to be a completely released being. But since that was the one thing I wanted and I was the one doing it, then I had to be some kind of an idiot. And appreciating the idiocy of that move kind of transcended or released it. And then I had a sort of month-long peak experience, a plateau experience, they call it. And during this period of time, there was a really rich sense of expansion of my mental space. It felt like, I always say, it was like an extra room was added to the house, but the room had no furniture in it yet. So at first, it's just like this empty, wonderful condition. But slowly you start being like, okay, what goes in this condition? What matches with it? And it turned out that because I've been doing all of this sociological study of the postmodern condition, that what went in this new room was postmodernism. And I thought, okay, who has something to say about what's on the other side of the postmodern and the relativistic? So you start looking around, you're like, oh, Nietzsche and Heidegger have a few things to say on this topic. And then you blunder into Ken Wilber. And I'm like, oh, I had a Ken Wilber book when I was a kid. It was pretty good, but I wasn't that impressed. But now you're like, oh, I have a set of problems that I need language for, and this guy claims he has a language for it. So I will join one of their online communities and see if I can get up to speed on the language, see if I pass as one of them. So I did that, felt like I passed, left the community. And then like 9 months later, you wake up one day and you're just like, I need community around this. It's not just an interest. I literally need to talk to people about this all the time, every day, or I'll go crazy. I'm like, okay, so I'll go back to that community with a different name. And some of them recognize you even though you've got a different name. And you think, okay, maybe these are my people. And everybody was really nice and started to ask me to do things, right? Do you want to run this? Do you want to run this? Do you want to speak at this thing? And I thought, well, if these are my people, I'll just say yes. And so I would just say yes, and they would move me along. And then pretty soon I'm developing elaborations of the theory and also compare and contrast with other models.
Yep. Just a second. For people listening who many people may be familiar with Integral and Ken Wilber, but just say a little bit. So there's this moment where you've had this kind of inner waking up, I would say, experience where it goes on for a month. There's some real shift, like this accumulation has led to you might say the Satori, not full on Satori, but you've gone from Ken shows to something more, a stronger, deeper experience. And you've then got this kind of room, metaphorically, that's added to the house of your being, of mind and being. And then you're looking at this kind of postmodern. So just for listeners, the classic, when we think of postmodern, maybe many people are familiar, but the classic thing is, there isn't an overall truth. There's just multiple perspectives, the postmodernism you said you saw yourselves in, maybe rather than I describe it, could you say, like, what was the condition of postmodernity? Because you said earlier on, I came back to America, it's the condition of postmodernity. And then what was this postmodernity you were looking for at that point? Just say briefly a little bit about that. And then I'd like to come to, look, what was it that you saw in Integral? Like, maybe just for people who aren't familiar, you can sketch that out. But first, what was the postmodern condition you were seeing around you in your society? And then the postmodernism you were looking for?
So the condition I was seeing around me, first of all, in some respects, it was a subjective and emotional experience primarily. You're a sense of darkness, a sense of fragmentarianism, a sense that people were no longer really communicating with each other, that they were all broken up and trying to generate new things or suffering from the breakup, but there was no real confidence that the civilization knew how to organize things. Like, I remember throwing a piece of paper toward a garbage can one day, and it didn't quite go in, and it dropped on the street, and I stood there looking at it for a while, and I thought, should I go and put that piece of paper in that garbage can, or should I just leave it there? And for some reason, I flashed in my mind all the covers of all the science magazines I read growing up, right? And each one of them was like, it's a mystery. We don't know. Everything is uncertainty. Relativity governs everything. We're blocked. We don't know how these two theories fit together. And I thought, all the messages are like, we don't have it. And I could imagine classical civilizations looking at us and going, these people are not generating a kind of functional faithfulness with each other. And sometimes that is the 1% tipping point. I thought, maybe if all the science magazines were saying, we've got the answer, then I would go and put that paper in that garbage right now. So there was this sense that there was a tilt to the system that was not spreading a confidence on which we could come together intersubjectively and emotionally, and also in action to solve any of our collective problems. And then there was a kind of reactionary liberal dogma in the academies and a counter reaction from these ridiculous faux conservatives. And all this stuff is the same problems we're dealing with now. And a lot of it was already at that time being accelerated or generated by digital information technologies and the attempt by the species to handle this new distributed web-like passing in and out of windows, multiple channel kind of a reality. And there was an apocalyptic mood to it, right? Apocalypses weren't necessarily happening, but everybody started to feel like we were either in the apocalypse or it was imminent, or this sort of affective glimmerings of the meta crisis. So this was the postmodern condition. And when I tried to feel deeply into the current world that I lived in, and this would have been like the late 90s or something like that, there was just this sense of static, like a Band-Aid had been ripped off, or like the signal was missing. And I was trying to probe for the divine in the world, and all I kept finding was this static. But then there was this,
This experience. I just want to, because I mean, I'm also late 90s. I mean, I remember coming, for myself, I remember this experience with a friend where we're teenagers and they start ripping apart a rose in their garden. And I'm like, why are you doing that? And he's like, why not? I remember this moment that I somehow felt so deep in my heart that it was not, it's not wrong to destroy a rose or something, but there might be times you do it, but there was just something like the arbitrary destruction of beauty. But he was not doing it to just be bad, but like there was no longer any rule, there was no longer an up or a down anymore. Yeah. And what struck me most was that I didn't have a compelling answer. I knew in my heart there was something, but I couldn't give him a rational answer. I couldn't give that thing you say of the magazines, but it happened not just in science, but then spread, it was in morality, it was all of these areas. And I also remember coming across Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero, which, Bret Easton Ellis, I feel is this, and the good version is Infinite Jest, what David Foster Wallace. These moments of there's something is coming apart at the seams here. And so
that was the feeling. And I think every interested and sensitive person was detecting it at that time.
Yes.
And there was my feeling was, even though I was all this time very actively and sincerely engaged in spiritual practice and spiritual communities, nonetheless, I didn't think it was okay for me to take refuge in their worldview. I had to go all the way down. I had to, if the Dharma was true, then the Dharma was in the current world. So I was digging and digging and digging and digging and exhausting myself all the time as well. But then there was this shift.
Yes.
Right. That was the result of many accumulating altered state experiences, but also of my experimentations and my ponderings and all that kind of stuff. And probably just some maturing as an organism, getting a little bit older, that kind of stuff, where I started to feel a redemptive coherence. And where was it coming from? Was it coming from somewhere in the society? Was it coming cosmically? Was it being generated as the result of inner work that I'd been doing? Was it the fundamental constituent of reality breaking through? There were many possibilities, but there was a sense of expansion, a sense of confirmation, a sense of hope is probably not the right word, but a kind of adventurous confidence about the future of the species. And it coincided with insights that just started to make sense. Like every time I would look at a really good argument for relativism of values and worldviews, or relativism of even ontology, I would say to myself, well, if everything's relative, obviously that's an absolutistic claim. So nobody's not an absolutist. So we're not relativism's not really an option, because the relativists are also absolutists. So we must be looking for the right kind of absolutism. And I would have these sorts of thoughts. And then it turned out,
And was this before or after this experience with the added room? This is what was happening after that experience, or around that time?
In and around the time, yeah. I think I'd had some fluxes of this occurring, but the added room was an extended period in which I sort of had the leisure to really inspect this new thing that felt very stable, felt like this now characterized me, kind of
So you
wiped
still
out my previous identity.
and you still have this intuition that is something postmodern. Like even postmodernism in its relativism is incoherent. It's a classic performative
Yeah,
contradiction.
yeah.
You see that for yourself. And I think it's also important, something in your story that's very powerful, is we can see things intellectually, but there's a moment they kind of land in us. They go beyond, oh, I get that argument, but to like, oh no, I can also feel this. I can see, just I intuitively read this great argument, but it's just kind of not right. And as you said, you feel something pulling through from reality. And so this is when you're starting to look for postmodern thinking or like worldview. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So there are some uh, famous thinkers that dealt with this. Like I'm working on a book on Nietzsche right now, and it's very clear to me he was pushing ahead into this zone, but like way ahead of the time when it meant anything to anybody. But in our current time period, there was, at least in North America, a kind of popular movement around these ideas, clustered around one particular thinker who had become internationally famous in the late 20th century, right? So Ken Wilber had kind of taken over the field of transpersonal psychology and started to unfold his own integral meta theory, which kept running into problems. And then he would modify the theory, and then he would be, I'm Wilbur 2, I'm Wilbur 3. There were these increasingly expansive versions of the kind of worldview he thought would be necessary to subsume nihilism, relativism, and postmodernity without canceling it, but in a way that built it into a new coherence. And so you have to take subjective and objective seriously, and you need a kind of like vertical developmental axis, and it has to be scientific and spiritual, and it has to be deeply evolutionary, and all these sort of things he laid out as necessary aspects of a theory. And so you get really versed in that and get into that community. This is what I did. And then you discover, well, actually, there's a lot of other communities that are doing similar things. I've
Which
got to,
one,
yeah.
for example, which ones did you come across as well as Integral, which you came across, and Wilbur?
So,
His ancestors, you're mentioning Nietzsche,
yeah.
there's obviously Aurobindo. I mean, people that Wilbur himself cites, Gebser, and so on. But what other actual communities or thinkers did you come across around that time, as well as
Yeah.
Wilbur's integral community?
So theory communities and practice communities, very interesting kind of a thing. Theory communities, some of the neo-Hegelians, some of the Gurdjieffians, the Bhaskarians, followers of Roy Bhaskar's critical realism, they were in, and they were in conversation with integral, as well as certain versions of complex systems theory. Obviously, the Game B movement was starting. Metamodernism was coming up. So these are like a
Yeah.
cluster of different overlapping theory communities. But then it turned out a lot of these people were interested in certain practical areas. So that turned out there's a lot of permaculturists in these fields, right? There's more and more of what we might call parametric architects. There's a lot of new kinds of computation people, a lot of sort of blockchain people in this space. So you're like, okay, there's an interesting overlap between people who are recognizing that this way of thinking is the solution to practical problems, and that it comes out of a respect for complexity and organic structures of various kinds. And then a whole bunch of other people who are coming in based on a philosophical awakening that they're having. And then some people are coming in just based on their own intuition or their spiritual realizations. And it seemed to me that this huge terrain had something in common, that it was very difficult for people to hear each other and reach across the different like sub networks and tribal tones in this space. And I ended up moving from doing mostly theory work, trying to push the edges of these models, to doing more kind of culture work, particularly around the work that the integral stage was doing. What Bruce and I started, even though Bruce and I were very focused on spirituality and philosophy, we thought there needed to be a more sort of free and anarchic discourse space where everybody who was coming into these spaces could explore their ideas. Now, there's a number of those at the moment, but there weren't too many
Yes.
6, 7 years ago. And what we also noticed was in a lot of these spaces, you usually only hear from the same couple of people, like the same people who are doing courses and have books. We need to be interviewing people who are starting podcasts just as much as we need to be interviewing people who've written books. We need to be interviewing people who have just found this stuff as much as we need to be interviewing people who've been doing it for 30 years, right? Because they're the topology of the whole field seemed to me the thing that needed to come forward in order to create the cultural basis of this, because the ideas aren't anything without the ethos.
And without their embodiment. I mean, that's something just to come back. So a couple of questions I had was, what do you think around maybe for you, what are some of the key insights you mentioned, maybe just one or two from Integral that you got, maybe just a bit concretely, like, well, not what I mean is spelled out a little bit. One could say, development, or an evolutionary approach, but what does that mean? And the second is, what do you think are some of the limitations? I mean, famously, like Wilber published first volume of Cosmos trilogy in sex ecology and spirituality, and there are a lot of notes floating around. But one of the things that I think are the kind of lacunae or edges of development for Integral or other areas in this kind of, in providing, and I think you framed it very well, in providing a new, I don't want to say intellectual frame, more of this worldview that allows us, they're not going to be one, but going beyond postmodernism that includes them and yet transcends them. So those two questions, like what some of the one or two things particularly you could mention that you really took, and discuss them, and then what are the kind of edges?
Yeah, there's some classic chunks of integral theory that I think a lot of people who get into it really find useful, even if they drop the theory later, they kind of keep those chunks, right? One is Wilber's notion of the quadrants, which is to say, when you're looking at any situation, you've got to keep in mind that there's objective and subjective and singular and plural aspects of it, right? That when you're like, oh, how does my community solve this? I'm like, well, it's going to depend partly on what's going on in the individuals, but also something mutual between them, but also the systems they enact, but also the physical structures and resources. You can't leave any of those out. That's the
Yes.
minimum you need to think about a problem. I think the notion of, I mean, it's very fraught, this notion of developmental stages of unfoldment and inclusion, and how well individual maturation in us matches up with something like social progress. A lot of debate around that, but it's very clarifying to have a notion of what these different worldview and value structures are like, so that when you turn on the news or you speak to somebody you're not used to speaking to, and they speak and you think, oh, I see where they're coming from. I see where this fits. I've actually have some experience of the layout of this particular band of human perception styles. You're like, I get it. So there's a
Yeah. I
way
mean,
that makes sense of the world, but also increases your empathy for people.
yes. I mean, just to make this concrete for listeners, I don't know, in my case, sometimes actually helped me a great deal thinking about my parents, or if people are thinking that people, suddenly this understanding of worldviews. And I think the addition here is that exists to some extent when you go and read Foucault, the order of things, or postmodernism, like, oh, anthropology. There are these very different ways of seeing the world and what's important, and even really, really seeing it, like, what it kind of exists and how it relates. And then there's this moment of like, but how sometimes they put together into a kind of paradigm, I think, which is there in anthropology, but is clearer when out of Gebser and Wilber. So, okay, if we're in modernity, let's put it simply, meritocracy, meritocracy is important. We are equal, but some people are better than others, and we should kind of reward that. And then, reason's really important. Feelings are still there, but they're kind of reasons what really matters, what's really important. Descartes doesn't say, I feel, therefore I am. He says, I think, therefore I am. And I'm just giving an example of, for people listening, I think that these understanding then, I could be in a culture where feelings are what are really important. Rather than being right, what really matters is feeling good. This would be a very different kind of culture. And this might be even a culture that many listeners have experienced those two worlds. And I even saw them, in my parents or in, people I was around. And as you're saying, when you start to see those, and they're kind of, we should be careful with them. They're, they can be made crude. We can get into like one is better than the other, but just seeing these kind of patterning, like you said with the quadrants, once you see it, you kind of never go back, in the sense of like, oh, I've got this kind of greater richness, that I can see the world. And as you say, give empathy to, for me at least, it helped, I always had this feeling my parents were never quite speaking to each other. And as a kid, I was just like, they love each other, they stay together, but why do they have these kind of arguments? Sometimes even sort of intellectual arguments, but never speak to each other. How can well-intentioned people do that so much, And then suddenly you're like, oh, there's these things you're not even aware of probably, but you're speaking from these different views. I mean, is that the kind of thing you're talking about there?
Yeah, absolutely. It increases your sympathy and increases your analysis of what's going on. Suddenly, the problem is not just who's right, but like how do these different configuration spaces dock with each other in a way that's generally useful and profitable? And there's no solution to our collective problems that involves everybody agreeing to one of these groups, right? It's not like we're going to, first of all, we get literally everybody to be modern, or we get literally everybody to become a Muslim, or like none of that's going to work. We have to accept that there are these different stylistic demographics that have to be incorporated into any solution we're trying to move forward on. The other thing that, like for many people, that I really enjoyed out of Wilber was this notion of the pre-trans fallacy, that something that's less sophisticated and more sophisticated than the conventional might seem like those are the same thing, right? Like I remember watching an old video of Ayn Rand's on 60 Minutes. It was black and white. She was talking about objectivism, and she was bemoaning the relapse of 1950s or 60s American youth into irrationalism. And she started to list off like gangs and tribalism and witchcraft. And then she mentioned Zen Buddhism. And I thought, well, that's weird that Zen Buddhism would be in that category. That's because my experience of that is of like a trans rational, and everybody there was very reasonable, very individualistic. And I thought, oh, she doesn't see the difference between what isn't yet rational and what includes rational and exceeds it. So this kind of a distinction is all over the place, right? Like, yes, a rock has no thoughts, but that doesn't mean the rock is the same as the Buddha, who also has no thoughts. They're on opposite sides. You're like, okay, so you have to make those kind of fine-tuned distinctions. And a lot of this is about nuancing finer distinctions necessary to build a kind of map for yourself and for each other that actually organizes the world we see. So these are some of the modules that I liked. And also, I tended to think in terms of modules, because as I started to think not of Wilber being correct, but Wilber being an example of something that human beings can do, which is to build a developmental meta theory that focuses on complexity and includes as many types of perspectives as possible. He was just a good example of someone trying to do that. So who else is doing that, and what do they all have in common? And to think like that, to think in the meta integrative space, is to think about, yes, these chunks of insight are correct, right? There's something to the pre-trans fallacy. There's something to making sure inside and outside and singular and plural. But the way he organized them, there's something personal and something arbitrary about that. And you don't have to organize them in that way, but you need to have those pieces. And some people have discovered these 5, and some people have discovered those 7, right? So how do you work with a space where lots of people have found some of these pieces and they've organized them in different ways? And how do you get a mutually supportive conversation going between those people? And everybody's version of it will have some drawbacks. There's some obvious drawbacks in Wilber's model and in the character of the community that formed around it.
But for example, not as critique, but what kind of things are the lacunae in the model that you think, or develop? I'd like to say, think developmental edges, places where one wants to continue evolving it.
Yeah, I think first of all, it doesn't do a very good job with highly anomalous phenomenon. It has a tendency to be reductive about certain elements of magic and UAPs and stuff like that. Things where there's a phenomenon that in order to describe it, you seemingly have to violate the difference between subjective and objective and singular and plural and human and non-human, right? There's ranges of experience that people have that don't fit neatly into these patterns. I always say it's it's the mouse under the carpet. Like if you take a really good model, like Wilber's model is pretty good, and you put it on a carpet, and under the carpet was a mouse, and the mouse now is just a bump and it moves around irrespective of the lines you've drawn on your map, right? So there's these sorts of anomalies that it doesn't handle very well. There's a sense in which it's too hard on pluralists, progressives, postmodernists, because it struggles to differentiate itself from the previous, so let's say, leading edge, avant-garde kind of human thinking. And so it really wants to say, I think, too hard that we've tried these solutions and they don't work, so now you have to migrate to second tier integrative metamodern solutions, without really acknowledging how much richness is in those late 20th century attempts, how much they're still with us and still growing and developing, and how much they aren't necessarily characterized by their most academic versions. Like you see this in Wilber the same way you see it in Jordan Peterson. There's like, oh, we got contaminated by French postmodernists and everything went downhill from there. And you're like, well, I don't know how much it was Foucault. It was just as much, psychedelics and rave culture and TV and going back to the land and the Muppet Show. Like there's a really broad and rich element to this that isn't quickly summarized. And Wilber does have to quickly summarize because he's trying to include so many things. I think when I say coaxial models, what I mean is to separate integration and differentiation. So in those models of development that are typical to integral, each step has more diversity and more integration of that diversity. But I tend to think of those as two separate variables, right? And there may be spots where you've got too much diversity to get maximum integration, or too much integration to expend your diversity. I think there's a tendency in which there's a simplistic forward-moving fantasy in a lot of these communities, as if the new thing is necessarily the next higher and deeper thing, whereas in reality, the next higher and deeper thing might have occurred 3,000 years ago. There might have been shamanic pockets. There might have been Renaissance pockets where people were actually several steps ahead of where we are now in development, right? So it's not like the future is necessarily the magic location where each new iteration is better and better. I think there's a lot of unnecessary mystification and metaphysics in some of the models. Wilber's own leanings toward Buddhist and Hindu mysticism and the notion of the cosmic witness, the way he handles the two truths doctrine of the conditional and the unconditional world. I think there's a lot more philosophical rigor that can be brought to those things that don't just sound like we're importing generic Eastern mysticism into this. I think there's a problem in terms of converting the ideas into practices.
That I wanted to come to, because I think that's one of the metaphor I sometimes have here is in cultural evolution or deep change in ourselves or in our society. It's a bit like playing the concert piano. I could tell you how to play a concert piano, but read these notes, put your fingers here, do it quickly. But we know it takes decades to, and maybe not, you can't play at that level. My point is, whereas we sometimes think it's like teaching someone to use an iPhone. All of the embodied complexity in an iPhone is basically hidden from you. A kid can turn to use it. And I think this is something I want to ask you about. Is like, there's a tendency, I think, also embodied for me, which is, I really, really admire. Wilber and Integral has had a massive impact on me. I'd say, and the things really, Wilber is also a synthesizer, a brilliant synthesizer. There's a lot of other things as well, that he, to appreciate in the lineage that he's really drawing from. And it has this heady tendency, a bit of like, once I've got it intellectually, it's like, I know how to read music. Now I'll be able to play like Glenn Gould. And I wanted to say more about that. What do you think it takes to embody some of these things? You were just about to talk that, but I wanted to kind of, plus one on that and hear more from you on that point.
Yeah, there's a number of different ways to go at that, right? Because there's interpersonal solutions, and then there's taking action in the world types of solutions. We were talking just before we came on here about the role that decision-making plays in that. And to me, decision-making is an example of an actual visceral integration process, right? Not a theoretical integration process where I accept there's something on this side and something on this side, and I accept there's a lot of different options. But the options that matter to me, my behavioral and affective options, the things I feel about in the world, those are the things I have to integrate. So this is where I lean a little bit more on something like the Gurdjieffian lineage that I wrote this book about last year, where it's a struggle, an intentional struggle to resolve the differences between your behavioral options and between your different internal systems, right? We're not just saying like you have to take inside and outside and yes and no into consideration and mentally affirm. You have to actually undergo what it's like for them to struggle against each other. Because in ourselves, in our nervous systems, each of these perspectives, each of these values, each of these aspects of reality relate to different neurological and informational systems within us. And they don't automatically integrate. They don't automatically coordinate. If we want more integration, we want more integrity, we have to do work to make those things coordinate. And since they naturally don't want to, you have to kind of force them. Right? They say neurons that fire together wire together. You have to get these things to work in tandem so that they start to grow together into the same structure. But that looks like work. It looks like development. It looks like suffering and remorse. It looks like being willing to wrestle with decisions. It looks like a whole practical dharma of how to almost force your different internal options up against each other until they start to become yoked together in a more interesting way.
And can you give an example, like, of in your own life? I mean, I give the example here, which is it's very easy to say, well, we live in a world free of hyper individualism. Modernity really pushed individualism to the max. In a way, post-modernity started to be like, well, the ecological world, and also we need to be more inclusive and horizontal. But actually, how do they integrate? Like what would what does it look like to still have the autonomy and yet have collective action? In practical terms, we run residencies at the Life Itself hubs. People come and we just practically see, like, there's supposed to be collective care where you all clean together or cook or things. And yet people are like, well, I've got a Zoom call, or we've all tried to agree a time, but this practical thing of like the day-to-day of like, do we have a common time? Do we all show up at that time? How do we agree on it? What happens if there are things we really need to do together? How have you seen that actually come out in your life? Or what have you seen where there are maybe success or failures? Like, where the ideas are there, but it doesn't get really realized, or the other way, what have you seen as the ways where you see people really moving towards that? And it may not be like the fact they've got lots of integral theory. It's maybe more they've got certain practice. But I'm giving a concrete example, and you could have other examples of integrations of polarities. But that's a big part of like the integral point, right? Of this. Yeah. So I'd love to ask on that point.
Yeah. So first, let me make this distinction that I make a lot, which is integralists and integralites, right? An integralist is somebody who knows the theory, but whether they live it or not, it's uncertain, because you can learn ideas at basically any level of sophistication. And then there's an integralite, which I think is somebody who just inhabits this kind of reality space, regardless of whether they've heard of anybody's theories or not, right? So first of all, more of those people, finding the people who are already instinctively growing to inhabit these kinds of territories, because they are much easier to coordinate around this stuff, because for them, it's already a visceral reality. Second is, like I was saying a minute ago, visceral practices inside. So it's one thing to be able to say, I affirm both autonomy and communion. It's another thing to go, well, maybe I could actually build a mental shape that when I say it says both of them automatically, right? I spent a lot of time trying to build those sorts of high-grade meta-level philosophical structures so that by its very nature, like a Mobius strip, it's got both options built into its very architecture. That's great, but that doesn't change you, right? In order for you to become the kind of person that can participate in communities that instantiate this stuff, you have to deal with it in terms of your own attraction to these things, right? Inside yourself, you're like, oh, I I really want more autonomy, more individuality. I also really want to be in more communion, more effective relationship, more mutuality. If I don't let either of those go, and I don't see how one can be reduced to the other, then I kind of have to struggle between those two. And the stronger the attraction to both of them, and the more I refuse to let myself put one of them down, the more a kind of turbulence that slowly smooths out begins within myself. And then I become the kind of person whose being and instincts are more able to adapt to the kind of communities we're setting up. So, given all of that, then there are practical ways to hold those communities. Some of it's experimental because we're all just figuring it out. But the people that have these characteristics are better at helping create the ethos that can solve for those complex problems as they emerge.
What kind of patterns, I mean, what kind of do you see any kind of patterns emerging there? And I would ask as maybe even a specific point, which is one other distinction that again, Wilber and Integral kind of distill, although it exists before, is different domains or lines of development, ontological in inner capacity shifts. So often, one of this, even in Wilber 1, there's really kind of almost one line, and a big breakthrough is that there are these multiple, the quadrants and lines in each of the quadrants. So the classic one is there's waking up, I can spiritually evolution or move around in that kind of domain, in different locations I could be. There's the worldview kind of growing up domain, and then there's, cleaning up, there's the shadow work domain. I guess I've got a growing hypothesis I'd like to ask a bit about, which is that often, worldview is really valuable, but I feel that like in terms of this thing of actually then doing the work without the shadow part particularly is really crucial. But I guess that's just one specific point, but maybe other patterns. Like, so that's a pattern for me, is like if a community isn't, or people aren't really doing the shadow work side of like dealing with my reactivity, I could be doing quite a lot of contemplation. I could be doing quite a lot of sitting meditation, and it will help. And I could be doing quite a lot of like, oh, I've got this, I've read Integral, I've got this kind of teal worldview. But without that dimension of it, practically a lot of breakdowns seem to happen in my experience. Or another question which I like to ask people at Expert Integral is, what line is second person perspective? Not second person perspective physically, like a kid can see that someone else is sitting here, they can see, but real second person perspective as an adult. I can be in your shoes. But those kind of questions. So overall, do you see a pattern? How important do you think is shadow work, versus the other potential domains? Do you even see it as distinct? Are there distinct domains? And, what about second person perspective? I always wonder about this when I look at the integral psychographs, is where does that capacity show up? And I think I say that again, because again, in community at least, and collectives, whether that's work, whether we're doing a project together, whether we're trying to live together, taking second person perspective genuinely, which we all fail at sometimes, but when we can do it, is a superpower. So I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, a lot of what I do is listening across these different overlapping communities. And what I'm listening for are sort of two things. One is what I'm not hearing very much of that I might need to promote a little bit. And the other one is what I'm hearing a lot of. And something I'm hearing a lot of is shadow work and intersubjectivity. Shadow work and intersubjectivity, right? It's where a lot of people's unfolding appreciation of what we need to do, that's where that's going. And I think that shadow work is interesting. And first of all, it's built into the theory, right?
Yes.
Because you can do a lot of contemplation of your fear, but the contemplation of that fear won't tell you if that fear was secretly anger disguising itself as fear, right? Or some kind of other psychoanalytic weirdness, right? Some people this is a famous thing where if you can't tolerate your own aggression, you might imagine aggression possessed by the other, and then your response might be fear. And then if you sit with your fear, you might establish a productive distance from it in your own development, but you've left out what it actually was. So there's all this kind of work that needs to go on. And two things about that. One is what's required in order for us to do shadow work, particularly coming out of a Buddhist background where the idea was your brain gets better at practicing whatever you go through. So if you think you're going to express your negative and your shadow side, you're actually going to get better at being that. So there's this concern there, right? So that has to do with whether there's coherence, whether you're holding a coherent state when you go into these explorations. And sometimes another person can hold that state for you, but we have to be able to move in and out of shadow material. And there's a lot of different interesting ways to do that, right? The role of the plurality of the self comes into play in all these things. Another aspect of it is, where are the conditions under which your shadow is elicited? So there's this woman, Byron Katie, who has this really, neat, compact way of doing shadow work. But she always says the hardest thing is getting the material to do the process on. And one of the things we see, and I think one of the things that's been holding back New Thought and New Culture communities for quite a while, is we like to jump in, we like to all be on the same page, and we're all participating and we're all open. But in reality, that's not how human beings and human communities evolve. We have organic root structures, we have emergent high trust subnetworks that form special relationships with people of different kinds within the general field. And these relationships are where we activate parts of ourselves that we otherwise keep hidden, right? So there's all kinds of shit that you're going to be willing to bring up with your intimate partner that you're going to completely conceal even from other people who are your collaborators in the space. So your ability to do shadow work depends on your ability to access the material, which in turn depends upon trust-based relationships forming in a natural way and not a sort of forced top-down way. So I think that's really important to look at in these communities. As for the intersubjectivity part, right, second person perspective, which is the lower left zone on a Wilber grid, I think there's a whole don't want to say a ladder, but an undetermined amount of potential richness and potency in human intersubjectivity that we haven't charted yet. And it depends on a variety of capacities, right? Some of it is cognitively trying to take the perspective of the other. Some of it is engaging in physical and emotional activities that put you into high degrees of attunement. Some of it is we space practices. Some of it is trying to form collective entities on purpose. There's a lot of experimentation necessary in this area. And in many respects, this experimentation is related to building culture in general. So a bunch of the work that I did was around interpreting spirituality and religion through a developmental lens, which means not over-privileging mythic membership approaches as if that was the fundamental definition of religion and spirituality, but looking at religion and spirituality as something that occurs in archaic, classical, modern, postmodern, integrative, in any kind of scenario under any kind of a name. And when you do that kind of analysis, you get a model where, at least I did, integration surplus, whether it's between your individual components to produce your spirituality or between the functions and groups and genres of your society to produce something like a sacred interpersonal experience, which is our religiosity. Now, that kind of experience and the production of that shared experience, especially at the civic level, is something that has been collapsing, at least in the West, probably globally for some time. And whether it's in small niche pockets of community or in the broader sort of nation-scape of the world, we need to be able to produce very high intensity, high quality intersubjectivity so that there's a sacred value experientially in the community and an ability to mobilize together on shared values. Because a lot of our collective problems, we actually do have potential solutions to, but we're not mobilizing outside of our existing habit pattern. And a lot of that's because we're not sharing a sense of sacred civics that's strong enough to do that.
So if I could, that was amazing, Layman. And so if I would just translate it for myself, maybe one of the things is we need to act together, for example, to address the climate situation or a variety of things. Doing that requires some sense of collective identity and collective shared value. And that often there's some sense of a bigger we that we are part of, and also that we share kind of agreement. And often that's come through things like religion, even things like the nation state religion, that, and the issue is I think, by the way, I don't want to go too much in this, but my sense, one of the things we learned at Life Itself, and I'm sure many others, was there's a lot of background trauma, almost collective trauma about those things, which is why there's so much reaction to them. But when we lose them, we end up without that bonding that we would have. How can we act together? So this kind of one of the key things is how do we recreate these, like, we used to have rituals. We went to churches together. Or you go to an NFL football game, but we see these things, but they're now kind of marginalized in our society. And as you say, like, how do we create the kind of sacred spaces and the values that might arise collectively among us in that is something we've lost a great deal. Am I doing a fair justice to some of what you were saying?
Absolutely. Right. And one of the signs is culture war, right? The tearing apart of the shared civic field that we exist in, right? And the reason is not because there's different people with different views. The reason is there's no unifying thing that they share in addition to their different values and views.
Yes.
And that's a result of actual practices and shared experiences, not the result of, first of all, agreeing to all the same values and then agreeing to the same narrative about reality, right? Like, we need to do something to be much better custodians of the ecosystem on this planet in a way that advantages us and the biodiversity we depend on. That's not going to be the result of everybody agreeing about the nature and cause of climate change first, and then getting on board with projects, right? We need projects we can get on board with despite our variations in narrative, values, and worldview, because it's the practices and the projects that bring us together, the instantiations, and not the story that we're telling each other. If we get a shared story, that tends to emerge historically out of people who are sharing practices and challenges together.
Got you. And do you think that sometimes in the past there has been this, maybe not the story about, let's say, climate change, but there's some deeper story about, like, we're all Americans, we're all Christians, we're all X, that there were underlying stories, maybe which had come out of shared practices, which were the kind of ground base on which then other diversity of view could exist and constructively engage? Or was it always that it was practice and projects that we worked on first? Or was there some?
It's both, because to some degree, storytelling is a practice, right? None of these things are completely exclusive from each other. And there are ways of making a story have effects on individuals, and there are ways of making a story match up to our background sense of what reality consists of. So one of the reasons a lot of classic stories we use to get collective meaning fail is they just don't match the world that we're living in. So even if we believe in them very strongly and tell everyone, there's an uneasiness within us about how well they map to the world we exist in. But I would say something like, let's take the story, We're All Americans. Right? That story has been told for 200 years. But within that telling, there have been times where it really seemed like they were coming together, and there are times where it seemed like that story was having no effect at all. So there's some other factor that makes the difference, right? We see this thing happened in the mid-20th century where America became the dominant world power, right? That it retooled its economy and society in the 1940s with a huge new social support network, huge involvement in the war, and a tremendously rich 1950s and 60s period where they were the cultural powerhouse on the planet, where everything interesting was coming out of America, where they were developing and implementing new technology collectively at an astonishing rate. Right. And that's largely, I think, because of the things that they had to do around the war and in response to the Great Depression. They all started to work together on a project that mattered. People were taken out of their own little pools and moved around, right? That they were collectively mixing and collectively engaged in a huge task. And that this created a period of expansive capacity for abundance. Now, they were telling themselves the same story they've been telling 20 years earlier and the same story they were telling 20 years later. But it was the period of the circumstance and the praxis that made that into a reality.
Yes, I mean this is also one says I would say the dark Renaissance. That there's dark age before the Renaissance. This catalytic effect of challenge, if it's at least met the challenge rather than just subsuming us, is the catalyst for that growth. I must say for today we should draw things. It's been amazing. I feel there's almost a bit of a follow-up of like this role of religion, spirituality, and the coming together and what that looks like to forge a new world that we should explore. But maybe I would say next episode, which I hope we'll have a follow up. So Layman, I would love to invite you. What any last words as we check out? Like, what would you like to leave people with? If there's anything you want to say right here at the end.
Hmm. Yeah, and I agree. I feel like for me, a lot of this stuff is background. So I feel like this is the prologue to a discussion. I'm looking forward to that discussion. Um, I would like to suggest to people that any attempt they make to coordinate their different intelligence systems is really useful, right? There's Gardner's multiple intelligences got folded into the integral model, and there's cognitive and there's emotional and there's affective and there's spiritual and there's kinesthetic. We have these different parts. Heart, mind, and body. It's a really simple way to think about three major intelligence systems. And the more you can bring all three of those to bear on the circumstances of your life or on whatever you're reading, the more of an integrated and integrative response you're going to get, the more you're going to learn and understand, and the more you're going to show up in the world as an integrative being. And those are the people we need in enormous numbers right now.
Layman, thank you so much. I look forward to our next episode. Have a great time, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this. Until next time.